All right, good morning, everyone. As you're logging in, if you have access, can you please put your name in the chat? Tell us what brings you here this morning. And if you'd like to tell us if you're a student or an instructor or what your role might be. We want to make sure that we can get everyone their certificates also, so we need to make sure we have all your names. And we'll be getting started in about 4 minutes.
Yeah. Well, we had 117 people register for this.
Wow. Well, then
So
we've got some.
I know what that means in terms of real numbers of people showing up on a Friday at 11, but we
Absolutely.
that should, you know, end up with a pretty good number of people.
Absolutely. You don't have to, but if you'd like, you can also on your screen, you could change your screen name so that if you're showing up as a phone rather than a name, you can go to the 3, if you look at your picture, there's 3 dots in the corner and you can rename yourself that way.
Also, we are recording this session. So if you want to not be recorded, you can keep your video off.
Yes.
But we are recording it.
Thank you, Ashley and Ying Mei. So for others who are just joining us, if you could please put your name in the chat, sort of what is bringing you here this morning and where you're coming from. Meaning, like, are you a student? Are you coming primarily as a parent, as a college instructor, any of those, teacher in the community?
Nadiyah, how long has teaching in a diverse society been part of the curriculum, been part of the program?
The CAP 8. Let's see, I started in 2009. So I think somewhere around 2009, 2010, they were just finishing up the CAP alignment project, curriculum alignment project, and it was part of that since then.
Okay.
But it was at Chabot and Las Positas before that.
Okay.
Yeah. Cerritos. Oh my goodness, we have people from all over.
Oh, yay, good.
Yes, good morning. I see that we have some folks from CCSF and Chabot and Cerritos College and CCFS.
So as you arrive, please sign in with your name and tell us who you are. You know, are you a teacher, a parent, a college instructor, a student? And tell us what brought you here today.
And thank you. And as you, Alice mentioned earlier, we are going to be recording this session. And so just if you prefer not to have your face be part of that recording, you know, you're welcome to turn off the camera or put a pretty picture up or something like that. Yes, and I'm glad that people are here to learn more about anti-bias education. So Alice, I wonder if we should go ahead and get started just because we only have an hour.
Yes.
All right.
Yes. So hi, everybody. Welcome to this class, this presentation, Beyond the Diversity course, Anti-Bias Education Throughout PCE Curriculum. I think if you're not familiar with the term diversity course, by that we mean the course that's generally known as I've taught this class for years now, I'm blanking. Teaching in a Diverse Society. And the point, and what Nadiyah and I are going to be talking about today is how to take some of those principles from that course and carry them into some of the other courses in the ECE curriculum that are part of the training for preschool teachers in California. And so I think you'll find we're going to give you some things to think about, and some ideas about different perspectives that you can take as you go through these other courses. So you want to bring up the slides again, Nadiyah? So you can go to the next one. I think.
Sorry, I was just trying to get my computer to be on the right thing.
So welcome. As we said, please sign into the chat with your name, and tell us what brought you here today, and give us an idea of your role. Are you a ECE student? Are you an instructor? What college are you from? We're going to be sending out certificates of attendance, so we want to make sure we have everyone's name. Our agenda today, we're going to be talking first of all about the who, and that is, who are we? Who are your presenters? And who are you in the learning process? And we're going to ask you a question about your experience being reflected in the classes you're taking if you're a student. And the what are we talking? What do we mean when we talk about anti-bias education and anti-racist teaching?
Sorry,
and and why is it important? So as we said before, we are recording this session. So if you don't want to be on the recording, you can turn off your video. So we can go to the next slide and you can see a little about us.
Yes, and as I move to that slide, I just want to add, we have a wide variety of audience members today. So we have some faculty, we have a lot of students, we have some folks who are coming primarily thinking about their own children. So we will do our best to kind of connect the dots for all of those pieces. When people enrolled, it was mostly students at the time, and so we are kind of geared a little bit in that direction, but we feel that all the instructors on the course will get something for sure too.
So here's some little mini bios for each of us. I'm Alice, the one on the left. I came to ECE late in life after a long career doing other things. But since I've been in early childhood, I've worked as a preschool teacher, which I left off of here for some reason. And then I worked as doing some workforce development things as professional development coordinator. I worked for First Five as a quality counts rater, if any of you are involved in Quality Counts California. I've been an instructor at Chabot since 2015, and the Teaching in Diverse Society course is my favorite to teach. And I'm really interested in equity, and not only in teacher education, not only equity for teaching students, but equity for their students as well.
Absolutely. Yes. So yeah, just briefly, I'm Nadiyah Taylor. I am I work at Las Positas College, and I have sort of started my whole life around early care and education. And so I taught, as you can see, a variety of ages, mostly preschool. I've had the good opportunity to be a college instructor for some time, and also to really work directly with child development programs, as well as some elementary schools, really thinking about how do we incorporate diversity and inclusion and those concepts around justice and social justice into education at all levels. So I'm very happy for you all to be here today. So first of all, I just want to say I'm seeing everyone in the chat, and I'm really glad that you're here, and we're going to go and try and go through some information for you. So I think that Alice said this already, but we are going to provide the slide deck to you all later. And so I'm saying that because we have an hour, so it's a kind of short period of time. And so, take notes as you would like, but also just know that it may move a little bit. So one of the first things we wanted to do is really talk about some terms so that we are all sort of thinking in the same manner for this particular experience that we're having. So anti-bias education, I know that most people are here for that. And so very briefly, it's important to know that anti-bias education has 4 goals. And these goals are overarching And they're sort of like the lens through which you look at whatever kind of work that you're doing. So anti-bias education isn't considered an add-on. It's not a, today we're doing anti-bias education and tomorrow we're doing math. It's sort of the idea that we're going to continue to do anti-bias work, social justice work, however we are engaging. So this is a paraphrasing of the goals, but basically the first goal of anti-bias education is that we are focusing on our audience, in this case, you, for teachers of young children, the children, getting a deep understanding and acceptance for both themselves and their families. And the highlight for that one is many teachers already do this, but the piece that we want to make sure to add if we're doing anti-bias work is that we want to include those identities that sometimes are marginalized by society. So we want to think about if there's a child who identifies as non-binary, or they have a family member who is Muslim, or someone wears a hijab, or there's someone whose family member is Jehovah's Witness, or things like that. Identities that may not be as widely accepted or understood as part of the larger society. So we're making sure that we help children to feel really confident about all of these aspects of themselves. The second goal is really about then helping children to learn about other people in the world. So we're giving them some exposure, we're giving them understanding, and we're really helping young children to think about acceptance. And so with this goal, sometimes the stretch for us as educators and family members too, is to begin to use proper terminology as defined by that particular identity group, right? So we know that there are some folks who maybe are taking on the term Latinx, and others say, no, I'm Latino, or no, I'm Chicana, or no, I'm Mexican American, or no, I'm Guatemalan, right? So what is the terminology that is meaningful to that person in that population? And we start to help children to understand that. The third goal is really around how do we help children to begin to understand that there are things in the world that are not fair, and that when things are not fair, it hurts. Okay, so young children are often, after age 3, are very clear about that's not fair. I didn't like that. So we take that natural energy and we start to say, like, oh, is it fair that you didn't want to have Alice play on the monkey bars because you said she can't play because she's a girl? Like, does that feel fair? How do you think that made Alice feel? That might hurt Alice's feelings, right? So we start to introduce words like stereotyping and a bias, and that's hurtful. And the last part of goal of the anti-bias education kind of perspective is that then we help children learn to stand up for themselves, for others. And in our case as adults, how do we stand up when we see things that are unfair, or we feel like there's systems in place that are not working for us or for our students? Then we figure out how do we find others who are like us? How do we take actions that are sustainable and supported, and how do we get support? And the same kinds of behaviors we're doing with children. Okay, so that's a very fast overview, but those are the basic concepts of anti-bias education. So many of you probably have been hearing this term anti-racism, and the question is, well, how does anti-racism and anti-bias go together? They are connected. Anti-bias education, I'm seeing multiple pictures of Alice, sorry. The third and fourth goals of anti-bias education really fit quite nicely with anti-racism. But the difference is that anti-bias education looks at all kinds of biases, and anti-racism is very focused on racism, as opposed to sexism or heterosexism or other things. And the two things that are in common between anti-bias education and anti-racism education is that they're both active processes. So we are looking for opportunities to engage at the child level or at the adult level in understanding what is a system that supports or denies people access, that provides opportunities for them to be successful or creates things that are not successful, that we distribute assets equitably. And so the reason that this is interesting, well, for many reasons, but one of the things that sometimes educators ask, and this is educators adults or educators of children is, how much should I be involved? Should all the content come from the students? And with anti-bias and anti-racism work, part of what you're doing as the educator is you're looking for opportunities to hear when people are sharing ideas that could be indicating that they have a question or a curiosity or a misunderstanding about something, but also you're adding in information, right? And so one piece that really is helpful, I think, especially for adults as you start to learn about anti-bias work, is that we talk a lot about a system. So Alice and I both believe really strongly in equitable access to education. We both happen to be English speakers, right? The system of education in California for the community college level, in most cases, everything's taught in English. So we are part of a system that creates opportunity for English speakers that we can't consistently create opportunities for speakers of other languages, right? And so that's where there's sort of a difference between a personal feeling about doing important work and the system that you're working in, which is why we have to always be thinking about the system and the individual. Okay, I think we have just a couple more. Equity, we can think about, we talk a lot about equality, which means giving everyone the same. And equity is for, developmentally appropriate or differentiated instruction, kind of depending on what your language is that you're using. It's about providing people what they need to be successful, which is not always exactly the same. Okay, so we want everyone to have the same opportunities, and the way that we get there is through engaging in equity work. Okay. And diversity, we hear this term, it basically just is referring to the representation of different social identities: race, ethnicity, gender, class, faith, sexual orientation, age, neural diversity, things like that within a particular group. Okay. And then I think that's the last one. Yeah. So then inclusion. Inclusion is, well, we know from working with children with special needs, right? The idea of inclusion is that we are blending populations of people and we're giving them equal opportunities in the same space. So if we broaden that concept of inclusion to beyond, to include, but not only be focused on folks with special needs or differences, then we're talking about going beyond just having somebody be there and actually including them. Is their voice included? Is their perspective included? Are they free to bring their whole selves to that space? And so in education, in all levels of education, we're thinking about how are we actually legitimately and authentically including people and not just having them be a token. But we actually hear their voice and we consider their perspectives all legitimate and worth discussing and trying to figure out. Okay. So, so one of the things that we want to put out to you all, and please use the chat, is, so we've just gone pretty quickly through a set of definitions. And so as you think about your own experience taking classes or teaching classes, whatever space you're coming from today, how have you seen some of those topics that we just discussed being addressed in your classes? The concept of inclusion, equity, equality, the anti-bias principles, anti-racism. So if you would just take a moment to think about that and then add some ideas into the chat.
And while everyone's doing that, I just wanted to also, as we're going to go in to talk about some ideas and some of the specific courses as part of the ECD curriculum, I wanted to make clear, as I was working on this, I thought, wow, we could really come off like we're really harping on our colleagues not covering the right material. And I don't want you to get that impression. That I know that all of my colleagues, I think my colleagues in early childhood across this state and across this country are really dedicated to giving high quality education, are dedicated to creating equity. And but I also know that we're demanded to teach a lot of things in our classes, and that I've made the choice, and I know Nadiyah has, to prioritize these kinds of topics. I think it's time we really need to push these messages forward. And so that's what we're just asking, that people think about these topics. Are we talking about them? We should be talking about them. How can we bring these topics, elevate them, because they are really important. And as I was talking with Nadiyah at the beginning, is teaching in diverse society has been part of the CAP aligned curriculum since 2009, but we're still having issues in our classes about expulsions of children of color. So clearly we still need to do a lot of work in our field, and this is our attempt to sort of start that conversation.
Thank you. So
what do we have here?
So one person said for inclusion to include all families from different backgrounds. And someone asked me if I could review the terms again. So we talked about inclusion. We talked about the idea of representation. So like in children's books, in the classroom materials, having a commitment to taking action, equity. We talked about anti-racism, and we talked about anti-bias education or anti-bias perspective. So that's the overview. And go ahead.
Well, so somebody said that they are making an effort to bring families into the classroom. Of course, pre-COVID, that's a challenge now, but I think we hopefully we're moving back to a time where that'll be easier to do. Making sure that children's literature we offer is about a diverse range of topics. Someone else said anti-racist education is being promoted by teaching with resources that better portray the lives of Black and Indigenous lives rather than focusing on the white savior's history, tend to focus on. We need to create a safe space for our students, them about diversity, and that different cultures are also part of their normal. So yeah.
Yes.
So thank you all for sharing all of this.
Absolutely. And if you have more things that pop up as we go through, please feel free to add them in the chat. I am going to turn it over to Alice now.
So one of the courses that I was taking a look at and thinking about in these terms was, our sort of most basic class, child growth and development, which is the course where we learn about, the patterns, the sequences of development, the ages and stages and milestones of development. And it seems, on one hand that could be pretty cut and dried. How is that? There's a lot of standard wisdom about milestones in development, and how could that really be impacted by a discussion of racism or bias? So what I want you to do is think in terms of two different things when you think about child growth and development. And one is that we have to recognize the impact of racism and bias on development. It's clear from a lot of research and a lot of science that there has been a cumulative impact on people in our society who have been discriminated against, who lack access to things like healthcare and educational institutions. And it shows up in some pretty remarkable ways. One of which, because in child growth and development, you start talking about prenatal development. One thing to be aware of is that there's an incredible inequity in prenatal and maternity care for African-American women. Maternal and infant mortality is much higher in that community, not related to income. Beyonce and Serena Williams had serious complications of their pregnancies when they had babies, and they have access to a lot of wealth, and they're very affluent, and they have access to the best professionals, but they also felt this problem that a lot of African-American women talk about, that the medical institutions they deal with don't listen to them, didn't hear them. So that's one way you see this kind of impact of racism and bias. And there's longstanding issues with communities of color and their relationship with the healthcare system, going from the extreme of the Tuskegee experiment, where African-American men were made the unwitting subjects of an experiment about having venereal disease go untreated, which of course had terrible health consequences for those men, to just a sense that no one in the healthcare system listens to me. There's no one in the healthcare system who looks like me, who understands what's going on in my life. So those can be really big impacts on development. So it's important when we're studying development to understand that these things exist and these things go on. Another thing is to understand the generational impacts of racism and discrimination. And that is that it's not just about what's happening in this moment, but you have to understand that families that have part of communities that have had a history of racism and discrimination, that it's these have impacts on generations going forward. There's even a science called epigenetics about the impact of environment on genes and how the environment that one lives in can work on the expression of certain genes, and that you have to understand how these two things interact, right? It's not just genetic history and it's not just environment, but that these two things act on each other, and it's a sort of a cyclical thing, that you can have genetic impacts, genes that are impacted by environment, and then they result perhaps in certain behaviors or circumstances that then impact environment. Say you have a child who has a tendency to be a high needs baby. They're very sensorily sensitive, and they're born to a mother who might have suffering from postpartum depression and is not able to give that baby the nurturing that they need. That baby's behavior could then become more extreme, more crying, more behaviors that make it difficult for the mother to connect with the baby, and then that could continue to impact that child's relationships with other people, their relationships with people in school. So it's a cyclical thing. The other thing I think in child development that we have to recognize is the role that society plays in certain issues that impact development, that we tend to often impart blame or impart responsibility for these things solely to parents. I know that in a textbook I was using in a child growth and development class, the discussion of childhood obesity was all about, well, parents are overfeeding children, and parents pack inappropriate lunches, and parents give them too much sugar, and parents give them, aren't feeding them enough fiber and not enough fruits and vegetables, without any discussion of the fact that a lot of parents might not be able to afford high quality access to high quality produce at a grocery store, certainly not organic produce, which is priced out of the range for many families. They might live in a neighborhood in which they can't get to a grocery store. They don't have time to make a lot of home cooked meals. They might live in a neighborhood without a park, so the children have no place to play, that kind of thing. And that goes on not just for childhood obesity, but also issues like things like toxic stress, adverse childhood experiences. Those are not solely the responsibility. We have to understand that we have a societal role to play in the development of all of our children. So you want to go to the next slide, Nadiyah. And then the other thing we have to acknowledge when we're talking about studying child growth and development is we have to understand the impact of racism and bias on what we learn and what we know. And so I ask, is developmental theory weird? And weird is an acronym for Western, educated, industrialized, rich, and democratic. And, the theorists we study in that class are predominantly white European men who were looking at white European children and white European families. And so we have to really ask ourselves, is what those principles of development, can those really be applied across cultures? And for example, Piaget and his stages of development, there are several people who've pointed out if children, that doesn't really track across several cultures. That if children are in a culture, for instance, the experiment where they ask children if two balls of Play-Doh are the same amount of Play-Doh and one is smashed flat, this theory of conservation. They say children who grow up in cultures where parents are using clay all the time to make things, children pass right through that stage. They understand the quantities. Similarly, with children in cultures where they're using water and liquids a lot, they don't have that same, they move out of that stage about conservation. Another one is attachment theory. The experiments that were done about attachment theory were done on very particular kind and seen through a Western lens. This is what good attachment should look like. And we're realizing now that attachment looks very different in societies where their children have multiple caregivers from the day they're born. That looks very different than in a standard like American nuclear family where the mother is the primary caregiver from that point. And then the other thing we have to look at is how do some of our ideas and knowledge about child development get accepted as common knowledge? We tend to accept studies that we hear about, like the 30 million word gap is one example that you might have heard about low-income families don't talk enough to their children. And we don't, that study's been quoted something like 6,000 times. But you might not know that original study was done with 42 families and has not been replicated. And a lot of people now take great issue with that study, but you still hear about it a lot. And the other one example of this was in those of us who were alive in the 80s, the crack baby epidemic, that there were going to be all these children born addicted to crack, and they were going to be a huge burden on our educational system because they weren't going to develop correctly and they weren't going to be able to learn. And that turned out, that again was one very small study that got blown up in the media and turned out to be completely wrong. Those children they might have some developmental issues, but not to the extent that we were led to believe. So you really have to interrogate these things. You really have to ask, how did these ideas come about? How do we accept them? So I can go on to the next one. The other class I looked at was the observation and assessment class. And here, I think the big issue is, we have to ask ourselves, can we honestly assess children using tools that we have? Are they really culturally and linguistically appropriate to assess children, particularly, the 20% of children who come from families where English is not spoken at home? Are the tools we're using really working for that? And when we assess, are we conditioned to sort of focus on strengths, or are we looking for deficits? Are we looking for what this child is missing? And that often seems to creep into our language, I think, in early childhood. And if we don't share that child's culture, are we going to be able to see those strengths? I use a video in my class of a woman speaking to a group of educators about these kinds of issues. And she says, tell me the strengths of the families and communities in your community. And it's dead silence in the room. She says, anybody? Some strengths of the community you're in? And nobody can, and finally somebody says resilience. But that's an indication. We're not used to thinking of the strengths. We're used to thinking in terms of deficits, and we often get hung up on demographics. Well, this is a class full of low-income children, so we should expect to see such and such and such and such. We have to look beyond that. We also have to recognize cultural differences in behavior that are not necessarily delays. If a child is from a culture in which they are expected to sit and be quiet, they're not going to speak up and ask questions all the time like other children in the class. Is that going to be interpreted as a delay? And I've got some things, as we sent out the slide deck, there's some links here to some interesting information about this. And then the last thing I want to address that comes up in both, so you can just switch the slide here. In both of these topics, I wanted to talk a little about dual language learners. As Nadiyah was mentioning before, our educational system is set up for English speakers. Now, there are bilingual programs and immersion programs here and there, but and we have a lot of children in our programs who are not speaking English at home. And we have to really ask ourselves, when we're assessing them, when we're observing them, are we letting our bias color our view of these children? They might appear to be behind. In fact, Sometimes they might be, using sentences with words from both languages in the same sentence. That can be interpreted as being behind or being confused. They might communicate more non-verbally. They might communicate, the way they communicate feelings might look very different, because language around feelings is very tightly is cultural, and different cultures and different languages deal with words about feelings different ways. And the other thing that's really interesting as I was researching things to get ready for this, there's a lot we don't know about language development in young children. Especially, I kept coming across, we haven't studied this in infants and toddlers. We haven't looked at infants and toddlers. We don't really know what goes on with children 0 to 3. So there's a lot we don't know about how children acquire 2 languages at the same time, but we do know enough to know that there are real cognitive benefits to being bilingual. They just might appear later than we're expecting, and that it's really important to preserve the child's home language. So as we do things like study development in dual language learners and observe and assess dual language learners, these are the kinds of things we really have to keep in mind in terms of, being equitable and being fair. Are we looking at these children in a strength-based way, or are we looking at them in terms of deficits? So, and then I'm going to turn it over to you.
Yeah, and I will actually just piggyback on that last point, which is the other piece that we look at, again, when we're talking about systems, is there are some professors down at UCLA who've been looking at how much do community college education programs actually support teachers to learn about dual language learners. And so, that is a system that within ourselves that we also have to look at is, are we supporting our students to begin to have some of these strategies and information in a systemic way. So Alice, in terms of the slide deck, people gave you their email information when they're enrolled, right?
Yeah.
So you don't have to, I'm asking because some people are putting it in the chat. So you don't have to put it in the chat, where we will send it out to everyone who registered. Okay, so I'm going to talk about principles and practices, and which is for many programs the entry-level course, but it's not consistent for everyone. So Alice talked about some examples already connected to this idea, but so many of our, when we go, there's like a history chapter typically, and it talks about, who were the major players in getting us from the Greeks up to now, right? And so we have to think about like whose histories are being included and whose histories are not being included. And it really doesn't, just like intuitively, it doesn't really make sense considering that all humans have babies. It makes sense that all humans around the world have been curious about their babies and their children. And yet we have a very difficult time in the standard textbooks that we use actually finding out more about the histories of folks and how they looked at child development. And so it's coming, it's a growing practice. And so, on the slides, when you get them, there's a couple of organizations that are starting to tell us more about different folks who participated in the development of kind of the history of how we got to where we are today in terms of our thinking about specifically early childhood education and early elementary school development and learning theories. And so you can look at some of those resources. Also in this class, it's a great opportunity to start thinking about child expulsion practices and the impact of race and social class on those practices. So some of you may know that there's been some studies talking about just the rate of children at the younger than kindergarten age being expelled. And for many students and folks, that's kind of surprising because it's like, well, who would be expelling a child? But often in early childhood years, we talk about, well, it's not a good fit. It seems like we can't serve you in the way that you need to be served. So it's in a nicer package, but it's basically the same idea. You can't stay here, someone else has to help you. And unfortunately, it's it breaks down quite a lot on racial lines. And so there's some legislation that is being pursued at the state of California level, actually to prevent expulsion at the preschool level and to make it very, very difficult to do it at the elementary school level. And so sometimes in class, I have students watch a video where people are talking about this, and then students will think about, well, what do you think that's like for the family who has had a child expelled? What do you think that's like for the child, right? So typically a child who ends up being asked to leave is a child who, as Alice said, might have a lot of high needs. It could be that the child is expressing themselves in very culturally appropriate ways, but there's a mismatch in understanding between the caregiver, the educator, and that child. And because we're seeing this link to race, we know that there's racism and bias in that process and in the in the decision making. So there's some interesting research coming from San Jose State University. Dr. Luke Wood Jr. Has been looking at elementary expulsion, or no, Black children's experience in schools starting from pre-K up through third grade. And so some of the things that we talk about in this class is things like, you know, if this is sort of a beginning class where we may be working with folks who are like, well, how do I support a child, or how do I connect with a child? And, you know, an interesting study or experience that families have reported is that a child may come to Alice and say, you can make it bigger by moving your mouse over the middle of the screen where the invisible line is between this. Oh, you know, I have two screens. So yeah, when I try to do that, it just clicks it forward. But I'll keep trying to figure out how to do that. Sorry. Trying to figure out how to zoom in the slides a little bit, Alice. Sorry. So, you know, children will come to, I will come as a young child and say, Teacher Alice, Kate hurt me, and I'm a Black child. And Alice's first question is, well, what did you do? Right? There's this assumption that you are at fault as the child of color. And people watch children of color a lot to see what they're up to, right? They watch boys a lot. So anyway, these are some of the things that I think in a principles and practices course, either people can bring in their own experiences about how they felt in school, and as an instructor, right, I can be providing these opportunities to have a conversation. And this is also similar to what Alice talked about in the observation course and the child development course, is how do we begin to see children through a cultural lens? And how do we also help remember that all of us have a cultural lens? It is not just those of us who appear to be non-white. All of us have a cultural lens. So part of it is we don't, you know, I started off talking about anti-bias education and this focus on the institution or how systems are unfair. And so some of what happens is things get kind of confused. What we know turns into a stereotype or bias that then harms children. So it is true that children who are coming from a background where they have less resources because of income, because their communities have not been invested in, and they may not be going to the highest quality of schools, they may need some extra opportunities. And what that has turned into is people saying, oh, I see this child, I need to fix the child. I'm a caring, loving teacher, and I know that this child is likely to have a lot of challenges. And so I'm going to approach them completely from a deficit mindset. I'm going to assume that I need to fix something. And so there's some articles that I provided here about the idea of, let's think about the cultural wealth that children and families are bringing, and how do we learn to tap into that? And children are not simply a set of demographic factors to overcome, right? They're not just little walking holes that need to be filled. Thinking about families as partners, and I know that that is something that is inherent and taught about, I think, in almost all child development courses, at least in California. And yet it's very difficult for it to actually happen in practice, because having families as partners actually makes our job sometimes a little more difficult. We have to be willing to change some ideas and to think about what they're offering to us. And we have to be willing to have an open ear when someone says, hey, this isn't working for me. And as faculty, we are doing the same things, right? We're working on updating our practices because our students will let us know what's working and what's not. Okay. And then of course, continuing to connect children to literature that expands their minds and their opportunities to learn about themselves and the world. I think the last course we're going to talk about is the Child Health, Safety, and Nutrition course. And again, you can see where there's overlap for some of these things because Alice talked about some of this stuff. But again, in the Child Health, Safety, and Nutrition course, we really are supporting and learning about health and emotional health, mental health. Sometimes the course tends to focus a lot on like activities that you can do connected to health or setting up your first aid kit. And those are totally fine. And we also, it's a great opportunity to begin to examine each of us as instructors, our ECE students, and then the students who are working with young children. Many of us have deeply held thoughts and feelings about food, about body size, about what you should be feeding your child and what you shouldn't be feeding your child, right? And there's so many things that end up becoming connected to these social issues of race and beauty and access and social class. So there's this idea of things. I think I spelled it wrong. I spelled it food desserts. That should say food desert. There you go. So a food desert is actually a place where getting access to food that is healthy requires you to travel 5 miles or more to be able to get that food. So oftentimes when I've taught this class, I will hear students say, well, yeah, but that child eats McDonald's all the time, or they're always coming to school with Cheetos, or they're coming to school with Lunchables. If you think about that, those foods are readily available. You can find them at a liquor store. You can find them at Target. You can find them at your corner grocery store. And they tend to be lower cost. They are filling, and there's maybe even a tiny bit of nutrition. So if I am on a limited income, or I just don't have access to a car, and so I have to take 3 buses to get to the bigger grocery store, there's a very good chance that I'm going to take the options that are closer to me. And that doesn't make me a bad parent. And so how do we have a conversation with our young children and with ourselves about nutrition that doesn't end up turning into food shaming because we don't have an understanding of some of the issues that could be, right? Body shaming. I mean, we hear about this in kind of the adult world, but it's important to know that young children are thinking about bodies and body shaming already. I often share an experience in my class about there's a preschool team that I was working with, and there was an experience where one of the caregivers who would pick up a child had a very large body, and the children first were noticing. And then they started talking about this person's large body. And then they got to the point where they would like run up and hit that person on the butt, right? So they had crossed boundaries, and they somehow saw that this was okay behavior. So to take a very long process and truncate it, basically what the teachers did is they started asking the children about bodies and showing them pictures of people who had large bodies. And they said, what do you think about these people? And the children said, well, they're really fat and they don't care about themselves, and they eat really bad food, and they're not very happy. And so the teacher was concerned about this, right? They wrote it up for the children to see, and the families came in and they're like, where did these words come from? They came from your child, right? So if we go back to that bigger concept that Alice was talking about, children pick up messages from all over. It's not necessarily coming from the family, but in our society, we sometimes confuse being healthy with being tiny. You have 7-year-olds who are saying, I want to go to PE because I want to work out. Are we going to do a workout video in PE? Right. So there's a big focus on that. Anyway, so that's something that we could really explore in our classes and with our young children. There are social class issues. We are dealing with a climate crisis. There is no doubt about that. And so lots of people are thinking about how do we have reusable materials, things that don't go to waste and things like that. However, those things are expensive, much more expensive than plastic. And also healthy food. I mean, I'm not sure that the United States is the only place where healthy food is more expensive, but it is certainly a place where healthy food is more expensive. It actually costs more if you're going to just cook everything from scratch than buying a packaged meal. So I, again, have had experiences where there was a group of teachers I was working with, and they were just basically frustrated because they were warming up the children's food. And every time somebody sent it in plastic, that becomes harder to do with the microwave. But for a second, they were floating the idea of saying, you know what, we're just going to tell families if they don't send their food in glass dishes, we're not going to warm up their kids' food. Right. So first of all kinds of problems with that. But also, like, that's a class issue. You can't make a statement like that. And what are the problems, and how are you going to make families feel part of the environment or not part of the environment? And then we can think about what books we use, the images that we use. When we're talking about outside experiences, a lot of the pictures tend to be of able-bodied, thin, athletic build white people, sometimes Asian people. And so we want to think about if we're having all children be able to see that they can go outside and go hiking and enjoy the world outside, and to take in nature and do gardening, we have to think about the kinds of imagery that we're presenting to those children. And then, of course, we need to talk about, similarly to what Alice already said, but like emotional safety. Part of our child health, safety, and nutrition course is not just only about physical safety and risk taking. It's also about how are we creating emotionally safe environments. I had one person say to me, you know, I want my child to go to a school where the school is not the source of the racial trauma, or the school is not the source of the religious trauma. And so we want to think about, you know, what does trauma mean? What is trauma-informed care? Where are we talking about invisibility of families and their experiences in the curriculum? That actually fits quite well into this course around child health, safety, and nutrition. Okay. So we have just about 13 minutes left, and I don't have nutritious recipes to share with you all. I saw that in the chat. I do think, however, that one way that we can include families is to ask them, well, what recipes do you make at home? If we are learning in class, oh, that makes me mad, Jesselle, sorry. Anyway, I'm like being triggered by my child's own teacher right now, but yes, I don't like when teachers do that. I think teachers sometimes forget about how powerful their words are. And we speak out of frustration or anger because we're human beings. And then, you know, it's out there. The child has already been damaged, and we have to figure out how we can help to smooth those wrinkles out that we've just created. But in terms of yes, please.
No, go ahead. Finish your thought, and then I'll jump in after.
Okay. I was just going to say, for recipes, you know, as an adult student in college, you could, every student could bring in a favorite recipe from home, and then you all could figure out how to do that sort of nutrition mapping. You could also do similar things with children. And so it becomes a family cookbook that's in the classroom that connects children back to their culture. And you get to do some healthy planning, and you're not stigmatizing certain foods as being better or worse than others. So I will turn that over to Alice. Go ahead.
Well, I was also going to say, when you're talking about food and culture, you know, our ideas of healthy food tend to, again, be sort of Western or American, you know, ideas of that. And actually, there are lots of different foods that are eaten all over the world that are healthy, that we just, you know, that I might not be familiar with as somebody who grew up in the United States. And so we've got to start, I think, modeling our idea of what healthy food is, expanding that. You know, we got tons of play food in the dramatic play of all different kinds of cultures. Let's see that in our health and nutrition class. And that's an issue that families run into, about not, you know, they have trouble accessing the healthy foods from their culture on things like WIC and food stamps. So that's another place where we sort of see an institutional problem around understanding differences in culture. So we just wanted to throw out some thoughts here as we're wrapping up. So think about the kinds of things we've talked about, and, you know, you can think about what do you wish you were learning more about, and how do you want to see, how are your own life experiences being reflected in your courses? And if you have some thoughts on these, you can throw these up in the chat. But, you know, in terms of next steps, we're starting a conversation here. As I said, there's a lot of things you're studying as an early childhood teacher. And we really want to elevate these topics and make sure that everybody's thinking about them throughout their time as an ECE student. Because these are really important topics. You want to add in your own research. Go online and look up pioneers in Indigenous communities who started Head Start programs. A lot about our history is really about communities stepping up and saying, we're not really thrilled with the way the institutions are treating our kids, so we're going to provide schools. We're going to provide places where they're not shamed for their culture. You can find out some really interesting stuff. And, and I'd also encourage you to question what you hear. If you're in a class and you hear somebody make a broad statement about a group in terms of educational deficits or special needs, say, what is that based on? How really, who did that research? Is anybody contested that? Has our thinking about that changed? Because, there's always new research being done. And I don't think and a lot of the stuff that's reflected in the media tends to be the very sensational, like the crack baby story, very sensational, scared a lot of people in the suburbs about urban life. The stories about how those children turned out to be really okay, not so thrilling, not so exciting, didn't get as much play. So you really want to question these things and bring these things up. And I know it can be intimidating in a college class to question something your professor asks you. I love to get those questions, because if my thinking is challenged on something, I will definitely go back and relook at it. And I think Nadiyah probably would say the same. And I'd love to have those conversations started. And I'm very confident my colleagues around the state have a similar perspective on this.
Well, and I think the other part is that it doesn't have to be sort of confrontational, right? It could just say, like, I'm really curious because I keep hearing these things, or I had a different experience. How do you think that experience fits in? Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. I love to hear my students' experiences and their stories. So do we have anything? I'm going to take a look at the chat.
As you do that, I was just going to say, I think this encourages us also to think about our own selves. So I think sometimes people will say, like, as a Black person, we do X, Y, and Z, right? So trying to think about, well, is it true that my experience as a Black woman is the same as every other Black person's experience? Or can I really only talk about my own experience? Because then that gives everybody else the permission to just talk about their experiences. And then we can start to build from there. And that's what we're going to be doing with our young children as well. I see that someone put in the chat, are you saying, thank you for saying that in terms of the child is picky, Cynthia? Or something that I just said? We'll see. Oh, let's see. Me.
I sent Kate Brown, who is a ECE professor, said beyond the food and picture books, we as teachers need to unplug the notion that the teacher knows all. Another part of many cultures' outlooks. We can be learners as often as teachers. And I think that is an important point. Not only in our college classes, we're learning constantly as college instructors, but as teachers in the preschool classes, I think there is a tendency on the part of some families and on some part of some teachers to think that the relationship is all one way. The teacher's giving all the information to the family, and the family's supposed to go off of that information and raise their children, under the advice of the teacher. And really, it's got to be that reciprocal give and take relationship. We're learning from them, and we have things to share with them, but it isn't this idea of the teacher, the grand teacher giving out all of the wisdom.
Absolutely. And I just want to, there's two things in the chat that I want to comment on. So one is, one person said they were wishing they were learning more about this child development and early childhood development information in their elementary education courses. And so I definitely think that's an opportunity. We've been talking a lot as a system that we have to prepare folks to be able to work to consider the continuum of development from infants all the way up, in this case, to like 3rd or 4th grade. That's kind of the end of the early childhood years. And so as a student, how could you bring that up and say, oh, you know, can you tell me more? Like, how do we bring in family stories? How should I connect with the children when they have a kind of question that I'm not sure how to answer? Because I think that instructors are interested, but it's sort of like anyone who's worked with as a teacher in any capacity, there's always 1,000 things you have to do. And so there's ways that we forget, even things that we think are super important sometimes get lost along the way. So consider it an opportunity to support your instructor rather than something that is like, you're doing something bad against them. I know that, I think that Alice has to pop off, but I really want to answer this question that someone said about how to deal with a teacher who tells your child not to be so Black, or that your teacher's already always categorizing people. So I want to address those, but I want to give Alice a chance to say goodbye. She has another workshop to pop off to.
I got another workshop. I'm setting you up as the co-host, as the new host, Nadiyah. Thank you all very much for coming. And I hope that this is the first of many kinds of conversations and workshops we can do on this topic, because I think there really is a hunger on the part of a lot of teachers to be able to talk about these things and reflect on these things. So I'm really glad to see you all here, and I will be going. Bye-bye.
Okay. Thank you. Bye. And I will make sure to get everyone else out of here on time, because I know you probably have other workshops. So it kind of hurts my heart to hear that someone is saying, don't be so Black, because what that means is that teacher is coming with an expectation that there is a certain way to be as a human being, and that being so Black means something negative. So, and this is also similar for those of you who are in classes where your own instructors are talking about people according to their racial categories. So if I were the parent, I would be having a direct conversation with that teacher and asking, okay, so this is what my child reported, and I'd like you to tell me what you meant by that comment. And then we need to talk about, what does it mean that you are not only saying that to my child, but you've said it in front of other children. So now the whole class has this idea that there's something wrong with being Black and that you should avoid it, right? So for me, that's an intervention directly to the teacher, and also an intervention in discussing with the principal, because that one is fairly racist, and also just, it's a very shame-based kind of perspective. And so, you know, any child who is not white may be like, oh my gosh, does that mean I can be too Latina or too Asian or too this? And what does that mean? That sounds like a bad thing, right? For those of you who are experiencing this in your own classes as an adult, I want to say that most likely your teachers are trying to help you understand that people do have cultural differences, right? Everyone does not experience the world in the same way. And so one thing that you could offer to that instructor is to say, I noticed that you're saying that Asian people hold their babies in X, Y, and Z way. Do you think that's true for all Asians? Or are you helping us to understand that different communities have different caregiving practices, right? That there's a way you can ask these questions gently, but to help other classmates hear the question and to help your instructor hear the question. Also, for if you are a student in this environment, or if you're a faculty in this environment, come together and talk about these issues as like a teacher's club, or just, you know, let's have a conversation so that you can be thinking yourself and as a community about these topics. Because just like you can't do everything as a teacher of young children, your instructors can't do everything as teachers of adults, right? And so where do we come in and create our own conversations, and know that you have the power to create new experiences for you and as an instructor and as a teacher of children. I see people are logging off. So I just want to say thank you so much. I see a couple of people's emails, so thank you. And I can hang out for another 5 minutes if people just want to chat, but I also want to make sure you can get to your next workshops. So thank you.
Hello.
Hello. Hi. Yes, you're welcome. Thank you so much.
Can you PowerPoint for us?
Yes. So the plan is to send the PowerPoint to everyone who registered. If there's a different email address that is not the one you registered with, then you can email Alice Hale, which I put her name in. I'll put her address in the chat again. And then she can add you to the list of people that she emails the presentation to.
Yeah.
Thank you, Nadiyah. This is Veronica.
You're very welcome. Hi, Veronica. It's nice to hear you.
Wonderful. Great job. Thanks.
Thank you so much. Yes, thank you to everyone. I'm glad it was a helpful presentation.
Yeah.
And what about the certificate?
Say that
I-
again?
I have a question.
Sure.
Our certificate.
If the child in the classroom almost learn away how to or how the child pay attention on the class.
Oh, well, that's a really big question. So a lot of it depends on what's happening in the classroom. So some of it is the material interesting to the child? Is the classroom environment a calm one where the child feels safe to ask questions? Are you able to give individual support to that child when the opportunity arises? So for oftentimes when there's a child that's having a difficult time, the first thing that we do as teachers is really start an investigation process. So what's happening? Are there certain times of day when this child is having more challenges paying attention than other times of day? You know, even small things like, is the classroom got pictures all over the wall? Because sometimes we forget that that is an auditory or visual overload for some people. So your certificate will also be emailed out to you based on your registration. Okay. So that's just the beginning, and that's kind of a longer conversation, but I definitely think that's a great question, Janet, for you to bring up with either your instructor or a fellow teacher to kind of brainstorm some ideas. But it really is about like what's happening for the child and how can I support them rather than like what's wrong with this child.
Oh, it's mainly more the question about in the child.
Yeah, it's about watching the child and see what could be happening. Thank you, Sunita.
Okay, thank you.
You're very welcome. Have a great day.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye-bye. Thank you so much. All right, I'm going to go ahead and log off unless there's any last questions or comments. All right, thank you all so much. Have a great rest of your day.